Hi, everyone. I should probably speak to my own speaker. My name is Shiya. I'm a developer evangelist from Autodesk. I was hired initially at the San Francisco location, but because of visa issues, I had to relocate to Shanghai for a year. And today I'm here to talk about my experiences of developing in China. And it can be basically summed up as this. So every day, I walk into the Autodesk office and then log into Autodesk VPN, which is to San Francisco, and then start working. So let me do this again. I walk into the Autodesk office and log into the Autodesk VPN. This is just not something that you usually do in other countries. And so why should we care about developing in China? First of all, China has about 700 million. China has about 700 million of internet users. It's a huge number. It's about 21% of the world's internet users. That's about twice the population of the United States. So there are a lot of caveats of developing a website for China and that I wanted to talk about today. And it's for a huge audience, so there's a lot of benefits to it. And if you see from 2005 to now, the growth is huge. And most of the growth is from mobile. So there's a lot of backstory to that, but the growth is pretty huge. So what I'm going to talk about is you can kind of get away with doing the same thing for the rest of the world and the US because the rest of the world doesn't block Google. But in China, you kind of have to do, and there's a lot of things to watch out for. So this is about my download speed in China. And when I'm on an Autodesk VPN logging, trying to access whatever, Google or Facebook. But then once I get off the VPN, my download speed is about 100 megabytes in the company. So this makes a huge difference. Not just for a developer, not just for the user of your website, but also as a developer who just Google's Stack Overflow. So the first thing that is that the Node community in China has done is a private NPM registry. There's a Chinese registry that syncs from NPM every day, and it's much faster downloading in China. Like I said, my download ranks about 1 megabyte per second, and that's already on the VPN. So chances are sometimes it will be throttled. Sometimes if you download from the original NPM, sometimes it will be throttled. Sometimes it would just not work, and it would just time out. And it really depends on the weather to what happens. So you have to use the Chinese registry in China, and it's much faster. And then there's also a Chinese client. Well, it's basically the same people that developed the registry said that, oh, let's just do a different client here in China. And they have done, it's sort of like Yarn, but it has a different way to shrink wrap your package management. So, and another thing I wanted to talk about is I just wanted to throw it out there. This is very not brought up by other people, or actually, but still very important, is to translate your documentation. So English is a very hard language as a second language to read. Consider if you read documentation in French and you don't speak French. And that's just how Chinese developers feel. And having only English docs resulted in that neither React.js or AngularJS to be the most popular framework in China. The most popular framework is actually Vue.js. And the reason being that it just has Chinese documentation on the day of release. And one of the other things to watch out for is to use simple English. And don't use jokes. People don't really get it if they don't speak English. And this topic is very well studied for many years. So don't reinvent your own style guide. So, I wanted to do an emoji right here, but I guess it failed. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my own experience too. I work for Autodesk. Autodesk is a 3D software company. We design we have a computer-aided design software. Three of the biggest are like AutoCAD or Revit. basically they're really large files to be viewed on a very robust machine. So a lot of the times you see Revit, the minimum download requirement is 16 megabytes of memory and I series of processor, and that's just a minimum requirement. So what we did in my job with Autodesk Cloud Services is that we had a REST API that you upload your engineering design data to process in the cloud, which we deployed in AWS, which is in the US, which doesn't work well in China. And then one of the other things is that you download the geometry data and properties, which is also very, very large files. And we have a JavaScript library that to view these large files, which basically you reference and then it instantiates a WebGL canvas, and it references you need to reference multiple JavaScript files like 3JS or our own JavaScript file. So you pull a lot of 3D geometry from our servers, and it could be upwards from kilobytes to 100 megabytes, depending on how big your file is. I know, like for a web page, that's very, very large. That's usually very different from what people are used to developing. But what we had to work with was files much, much larger than this. Like earlier, I was talking about basically gigabytes of files. So think of it the cloud service as a container, uses the browser as a container to basically render a very, very large file. So how do we end up with Node? So most of our existing third-party developers come from the desktop. That means .NET and mostly .NET. So our APIs had a very high learning curve. You need to know server-side technology, which is basically calling the REST APIs and then like all the server-side goodies like access token and stuff. And you need to know client-side technology because the viewer is in JavaScript, and you need to put it on the page. And also to manipulate those geometry, you need to write GL. You need to know about graphics. So it's a very high learning curve, and one developer, it's very hard for one developer to master all these things. So we wanted to minimize developing difficulty for our users. And so basically, JavaScript, as a client-side technology already, it can also be used as a server-side language. And it can also write GL, which is another talk. So it's one language to rule them all. So to develop in China, it's nearly impossible to upload or download files to AWS Oregon. You're talking about 10 kilobytes per second sometimes. It really depends on the weather. And you have very slow NPM install if you don't use that mirror. And a lot of popular sites are blocked. So for cloud services, AWS has a complete separate deployment in China. It's completely disconnected to the rest of the world, so you can't really have an AWS instance in America and then just open up something new in China. It has to be completely separate. And the popular cloud service providers in China are these. Like, raise a hand to anyone who has ever heard of any of these companies. Okay, maybe 3 people. Okay. So yeah, you can't really use AWS, or AWS or Azure is not really the big players in cloud in China. And the affected sites includes Google and all its products, Facebook, Twitter, Dropbox, and the list goes on. So Google, in particular, has YouTube and a lot of CDNs like Google, and also Google Fonts. If your CSS reference that, it also won't work. So what you want to watch out for is, first, CDNs. Don't CDN from these websites. And the second thing is social logins. So a lot of sites have Facebook login, and if that is on your page, it will basically slow down your page load in China for about a minute. And then the page would, the browser will say, oh, it has timed out, and let's load the other resources. Front-end API calls to these block domains are also something to watch out for, and large file uploads and downloads. So, for example, if you're using Tinder and you need to log in with Facebook, then that means that to use this app, you need to have VPN. So if you're in China and you're looking to date software engineers who knows how to use VPN, this is the platform to go to. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what to do to counter these things, and it's going to sound completely different and counterintuitive to what best practices of the web is in the rest of the world. First, you want to use a Chinese CDN. That's OK. Or put all the dependencies on your own server, and that's very important. And the second thing is that there's an alternative to Facebook, Twitter logins called WeChat login. It's one of the biggest apps in China. Or implement your own login. So this is a bit counterintuitive. And so also, if you want to call a bunch of REST APIs to these block domains, you want to do them on the server side with an offshore server. So if you set up your own server on AWS and you call these requests to these block domains and wrap it up to seem that it comes from your server, the performance is just going to be so much better. It will go down from maybe 1 minute to 4 seconds. And this is something we have recommended a lot of our partners to do when they're uploading large files to our servers, is to upload it to a storage server that's offshore, for example, in Singapore or Tokyo or Hong Kong, and then have it communicate with American servers, so you don't waste time on your own to upload these files. Or just render a different page for people that are visiting from China. So I guess this talk is just a call to action to be mindful about the availability of the internet to the rest of the world, and to watch out for the caveats and make the internet usable for 100% of the world and not just 79%. And that's all my talk. Thank you. Right, yeah. Yeah, caching NPM is also another way to do it. Yeah.
How do you deal with some of the learning curves? Like, you said you have a lot of .NET developers, a lot of desktop developers traditionally. How did you deal with some of the learning curve of moving people onto Node and getting them to learn, that environment and whatnot? I guess, are there any good resources or tools that are over there that are good?
Great. So with our currently existing developers, they're desktop, so they're not even web. So they're not even, a lot of them are not even .NET web developers. So what, in China, I would say the best resources are still in the US. But there's definitely a lot of hand-holding going on. Like saying, you need to go to this website to download Node and npm install. But in the end, Node is still much simpler than setting up things like Tomcat or Maven. So that's the choice of what we're using right now.
So what are the most popular programming languages in China? How does Node adoption compare to the United States?
So Mike Rogers, when he was in China, he said that the download of Node.js is the highest number of download of a city for Node.js is in Beijing. I'm not sure compared to other languages, but I think China is actually the most popular country for Node.js.
If you're a small group or even one developer,
So it depends on if your project is open source. If it is, then and it's a good project, there's a lot of Chinese developers very eager to learn the technology and try to translate it. And basically just open source the documentation and people would start working on it. One question. So the question is, what are the good emulators to see if to mimic the user experience of someone in China? So the two things that we have been doing, first is basically throttle your internet to 100 kilobytes per second. That's the first thing. And the second is setting up a VM machine or a virtual machine in China. That's how you actually know how slow everything is when you visit these block domains. Question?
I was wondering, how does community support, say Stack Overflow equipment, how does that compare to what we have English?
You mean community supporting Node or? So for what kind of projects or?
For development in general.
Okay, so I guess that's one thing also China does it a bit differently. There's obviously everyone uses GitHub, but for each kind of user group, people would set up a WeChat group that you can have upwards of 500 members. It's kind of like Slack group, but Slack is blocked in China. So WeChat group is what people use, and users would talk to each other about it. Next question.
Was there any technical issues with the VPN technology because from my own experience, I didn't have much
Can you repeat the question? Do I have VPN recommendations?
the VPN technology that your company is using.
We just use Juniper's VPN, but a lot of for private NPMs, for your own VPNs, you can use ShadowSox. But as a company, it's you have to use a solution that you usually use from logging in outside of the company. So, question?
Are there any way to contact entrepreneurial Chinese developers from the West? Do you have any suggestions for the best way to do that?
So to contact entrepreneurs who are using Node.js in their company, there's a few WeChat groups, so I can pull you in if you download WeChat. It's like Slack, like I said. Okay. One more question?
I appreciate the tip on the WeChat.
Yeah.
You said that it would slow down, so say you have Facebook and Twitter, a whole bunch of integrations. If those are blocked, wouldn't that, and you add WeChat, wouldn't WeChat be the one that shows up as blocked? Or is that cause other issues?
WeChat is by Tencent. It's a company in China, so all its servers in China. And in lieu of a social login that's Facebook or Twitter, you can use something like WeChat so that people can log in securely in China without having to implement your own login solution.
Okay, you were saying that Facebook would slow it down for the Chinese users.
Mm-hmm.
That should be blocked, so that all
Right, that's right. But however, if you put in a Facebook login button on your page, it would call some JavaScript resources in Facebook, and that would slow down the rendering of the rest of the page. Okay. This.
We have one more minute, so we can do one real quick question.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Like when you download packages from
So when you download the packages, can you repeat the next part? Right. Can you make sure that they're not messing with the packages? I believe that I believe CMPN is actually open source. It's maintained by a bunch of Node.js advocates in China. So I guess you can't, like any company can like try to mess up with your packages. But I just don't see any reason to do that because CMPM is maintained by a company called Taobao, which is Alibaba, and it's one of the biggest internet companies in China.
Okay, I'm sorry, we gotta wrap. We're
Okay.
done, but thank you very
Well,
much.
we'll speak after.